Thanks.
Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to tonight's meeting, our June event for Meet a Deaf Professional. So this month we are thrilled to have our special guest join us tonight, Dr. Michael Schuyler. And his sign name is like what Briella just demonstrated. If at any time you have questions during our conversation tonight, please hold on to your comments or questions until the Q&A portion of tonight's event. There will be plenty of time for you to ask your questions or say your comments. So please, for the beginning of this, just sit back and listen to what Dr. Schuyler has to say about deaf gain. So, what is deaf gain? We're going to dive deep into that topic tonight. And before we, start diving in and swimming into what is the deaf gain, multiverse, I think that first I will give it away to Dr. Schuyler to please give a chance to talk about what is deaf gain and who is he and what brings him to this topic tonight.
Well, first, let me say thanks so much. We had really planned this way back in January, and then, stuff happened, and here we are, and it's June, and I'm thrilled to be here. It's wonderful to see so many faces here on the Zoom, and many of you I know, including my mom. She's here. Hey, Mom. Hi, Mom. Okay. My background is connected with this topic of deaf gain. And it started, a little bit ago. And also I'll go back and then we'll come forward to today. I was born, luckily, my mom and my father, they were both deaf. Lucky me. Mom and Dad both signed in our home. I mean, full speed sign language. So they emphasized different types of literacy, reading, writing, freedom of expression, poetry, those types of things. Every single night we read, or my mom or my father read, they took turns. With my dad, I remember the topics being kind of, in-depth science. We had a board in the house with photographs from space. At that time, I was quite young. Well, it was back in the 80s. The Voyager space shuttle went into space and they beamed back pictures from way out in space, Neptune, in fact. So they showed Saturn, and my dad, we actually looked at books about space, had in-depth discussions about science, about the universe in general, and all the things affiliated with it. Then with my mom, she was definitely into music. And so I, as a kid, we worked on rhythm. We worked on nursery rhymes. I'm sure all of you are familiar with those. Hickory dickory dock. The mouse ran up the clock. So there were many stories between the science side with my father and his creative stories and my mom's creativity as well. And everything, of course, was in American Sign Language. Gratefully for me, okay, and so it was and spoken language, just for clarification, Dr. Schuyler. Okay, yes, it was actually in both languages. Many times they would show me something in written form, sign it, speak it, show it to me again. So it wasn't just one way, it was multi-layers, multilinguistic, which is super important. My mom and dad were also, they read a lot of science material. And my mom on her side, she had the creative side, the artistic flair, whether it was painting, sculpting, mosaic. Oh, she even wove. She was a weaver. So many different artistic methods. So she would help me with my projects. So you couple those together, the science and the artistic side of my folks makes me who I am today, which has definitely had a positive impact on me. Another lucky thing about me is my brothers and sisters. Well, they love me and I love them, of course, but they were, I'm just gonna say that they were troublemakers. Not, big time, but I'm gonna call them, light-hearted troublemakers. So, if something happened, there was the finger pointing going. Anyway, so that helped me with my storytelling. And of course, everything was in sign language and in spoken English. So one important thing to share with you that happened early on in my life, when I was born, I could hear, I could speak. Over time, I lost my ability to hear. I am profoundly deaf today. Again, remember, I said I was lucky. Come on, I was raised culturally deaf and then became a deaf person. So perfect. So all of that together, just imagine the impact on me as an instructor and me as an artist. These are all as a researcher. Thank you, Briella, for the correction. As a researcher, yes, thank you for the clarification. So that's just like a smidge of my background. I could go, in depth into any topic that I just mentioned.
Perfect. Yes. And so what are you doing now?
Well, that's a great question. I talked about, all my background, and I promised we would come to today, but we didn't get there. So let's go there. So I don't know, several times in my life, I've had, a 2-hour lecture and I realized, oops, I completely forgot to mention who I am, my name, for example. Oops, but it happens. So again, moving forward to today. I went to school, to many different schools, which is quite interesting and did quite well, excelled and achieved. I'm not being a braggart, please don't take me wrong, but I did very well. So I was in many different, thank you, Brilla, many AP classes. I was in numerous extracurricular activities, from art, you name it, I did it. So when I was in high school, I worked, again, a variety of different jobs. And my family, historically, were all blue-collar workers. Both of my grandfathers on my mother and father's side were janitors. And I'm proud of that. I am proud of who they are. That is part of my history and part of my family. When it came to my work and I was in high school, I was a librarian. I worked as a mechanic. I did some light duty stuff, worked in the community, worked in a group home, just to give you some context. So I did I was jack of all trades. And then of course I am a teacher. And that's what I have done now to date. And I teach, again, all different types of things. I started teaching, well, way back when, I started teaching early education with children. For ages 4, roughly. It was called the Frog Friends. It's called the Frog Friends. Then later, let me think, 2 really positive experiences were at deaf schools and that environment. Then there was a shift. There was a shift in my thinking. Okay, I'm thinking about deaf people, sign language, and then thinking about, deaf pedagogy. Thank you. At the deaf school. And I'll talk about that a little bit more about the deaf pedagogy, but just hang tight for that for a second on that one. So, one really big, mind-blowing thing that happened to me, a light bulb moment. I was a student teacher standing in front of the class, had my PowerPoint right behind me, doing my lecture, pointing at things. And my mentoring teacher was like, no, you need to stop. And I'm like, whoa, what did I do wrong? Did I do something wrong? Did I say something wrong? And she said, Michael, you are thinking in English. Stop it. Well, she caught my attention. She said, you have to drop the English. You have to think about it in sign language. Think in sign. And I was like, oh boy, deer in the headlights, dead in the water. How am I going to do that? Because that is not what I do. And that question has stayed with me for the past 20 years. How do I think in sign language? How do I teach in 2 languages? In signing in ASL and in English. So I'm thinking way back, I was raised in a home with parents who spoke English and who were also deaf. So we did this thing called SimCom, right? But when I was in my beginning teaching years, I was doing SimCom, and I'm like, oh, I am part of the problem here. This SimCom is part of the problem because, the language, the strong side of this is English. That's the dominant one. And then the secondary is sign language. So if I drop the speaking portion, that means that the English is still there. The words are still there. They've not gone anywhere. I mean, look at that. The proof is on the page. The English is there. We're writing and reading it. But my speech was dropped. It shifted my whole teaching pedagogy, and it just rocked my world. And I changed how I looked at things. So that moment was a turning point for me. So again, I have all different kinds of community experiences, from deaf school. I was in a mainstream situation where I was the only deaf person. I traveled. As an itinerant teacher, thank you. So that meant I was doing a lot of driving and a lot of teaching, and then I would go and drive over to another place and teach over there, and I was all over the map. So I would drive 5.5 hours, 4 or 5 hours, but, I had to stop that. But anyway, so I became a college instructor then. It was first I was doing literacy, reading and writing, and then later I was training new deaf educators. And that's really what I do now. And that's roughly 8 years. I am a trainer for deaf educators. I do in-services, I do PD, professional development for deaf educators. And now a new position. I was just hired actually at UT. Oh! The interpreters stepped out of rule for a second, sorry. I'm here at the University of Tennessee as and focusing on research. What is that? What is this? It's like grant. Is it like grants or something? What is that? What's that? What making? Oh, producing. Thank you. Making is disseminating research. So I love it. It's different. It's a change of pace for me, but in many ways it is positive. And oh my gosh, I've got so much to do, but you know what? I enjoy the work that I'm doing. And if I have, 14 hours to sit and write, I will sit for 14 hours and write.
Right.
So that's where I am now. The first year at UT is completed. And now this next year, I'm going to start in August. I'm going to receive my first PhD. I'm mentoring my first PhD. for the interpreter clarification. Oh, interpreter clarification. You are be the mentor or you are mentored. Well, you already a doctor. So I'm becoming a mentor. Thank you. Yeah, so I'm going to start that in August. I'm going to start mentoring other PhD students. There's one particular student is, wow. I'm so super excited to introduce her to the department, and I'm just super excited for that.
Wow.
So that's where I'm at now.
That's wonderful. That really helps to know a little bit about who you are, your background, your past, how your past connects to who you are today.
Mhm.
So that really, helps to contextualize and just get a real holistic view of, who's Michael and who's Dr. Schuyler. So great. I want to go ahead and segue into our transition tonight of deaf gain.
Bring it on.
So let's start with the most simple, but also probably the most complicated question of this topic. What is deaf gain? So bring it on. What's deaf gain?
Great. I'm going to give a very precise, short answer. Then I will expand a little bit. Here we go.
Yes.
We're gonna look at it. We're gonna zoom in on it. Thank you, Kinsey. What does this mean, deaf gain? It's an ideological inversion. Ideological and how you see the world, how you perceive reality. And we're going to invert that. It's a full inversion, a full flip. And what does that mean? Okay, so for what, 250, 270 years, the Western Hemisphere has been researching deaf people, right? What does it mean? Deaf people are often looked down on.
Typically, yeah.
They are looked at in a negative light. And that just deaf people in general, and deafness in general. Deafness is considered a loss. It's a loss. My hearing is lost. I had my hearing and now I lost my hearing. So,
yes.
And a lot of research back in the day, and it's really not all that long ago, 1960s, it was published. The word that was demeaning, that was related to deafness and deaf people. It was considered mental retardation. The R word. You know what I'm talking about when I say the R word. We were labeled as retarded. And that was a very clinical perspective, a very negative perspective, a very pathetic, empathetic perspective. And people had problem with this. However, for, 250 years, this is all we had. It was, it was negative from top to bottom. There was a few things here and there that were like, yeah, thumbs up, deafness isn't so bad. But for most part, it was very few people. So it's that kind of thing. Deaf gain says, let's flip the switch. Okay? It's not a loss. Let's forget that word even exists. Deafness is basically about gaining or getting something. It's not about losing anything. It's a gain. I received something. So in this ASL, there are at least 3 signs for deaf gain. Let me show you. Each one has a little bit of a nuance to it, some meaning behind it. And annotation, the interpreter may have gotten that word wrong. So let me think about it. I want to make sure I remember all of them. There's deaf gain, deaf gain, that particular sign means ahead or beyond or transcend. We could use that word, transcend. Another is deaf, gain. Deaf, gain. I would translate that to say a privilege of some sort. That word is a little bit right now, politically speaking, a little sticky in the, you know, but it's deaf people do have a benefit to being deaf, which is a good thing. They have worth. They have merit. So there should be really celebrated. I mean, acceptance at a bare minimum. And then there's deaf gain. Deaf gain. Almost like a profit. You know, something in your pocket. Like something that you have that it's bestowed upon you, something that was created. So all three of these versions, they're all different. They all have their own different kind of nuance to them. But in my perspective, all three are like,
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's my perspective. So let's again, we're going to flip the switch. Go in basic here. We're not, again, we haven't lost anything. My identity isn't a negative. You know, it is more of a positive, wellspring. Thank you. Thanks for clarifying that. He said, I'm not really paying attention to the interpreter. I'm looking at the captions. I got my eyes all over. Thanks for catching on that. But anyways, so that was the beginning of my answer, and I could go in depth on each one. There's so much more to share, but that's the basic idea.
That's wonderful. I mean, that's a perfect way to conceptualize what deaf gain is and kind of what's going on in the community discussion. And there's many layers to it. So that's great. You showed that well. So there has been some research on deaf gain. And from that, there are 3 types of deaf gain that has been established. The first being
Cognitive.
A cognitive, yes. Thank you. Also a creative, and also a cultural. So with those 3 in mind, what is your perspective on that? Do you think that truly is the case with deaf gain, or do you have a little bit more to share with that?
Another great question. The idea of deafness happens in a workshop. The idea of deaf gain came up in a workshop. The person that was leading that workshop decided to go ahead with, to dive in and kind of take a real microscopic look at this thing called deaf gain. So again, basically speaking, there was a definition put out that summarized deaf gain as something good that had potential for being good. And then it was like 2010 that there was a published document, paper, or a chapter in a book written by 2 gentlemen, Bauman and Murray. I put it in the chat for the audience. Perfect. So Bauman and Murray did a little research together, and came up with this concept of deaf gain. What is it? They had like a spatial map, like a diagram of how this deaf gain is like a spider web that we could gain from this. And there was about in 2010, again, back to 2010 to 2013, the two gentlemen collected a whole lot of information from and manuscripts for a book. And in that process, they identified at least 5 categories, all related to deaf gain. In addition, there were the 3 that you mentioned plus 2 others. There was the creative aspect of deaf gain, and that means things like the work of deaf poetry, the visual aspect of the world in deaf poetry, and how that is used in language, in creativity. That's just one example. A man named Justin Perez, he led the group called VV, Visual Vernacular. VV, one of the most innovative forms of poetry happening right now for deaf people. And this is led by a Hispanic individual. So people who sign can innovate and create in different ways to represent the idea of poetry with sign language. And so they worked as a team. And so that was a great example of teamwork from Rochester and Chicago. And it was a butterfly word project. One was hearing, one was deaf in this team. Peter Cook was involved, and another person named Penny Lerner. They came together and created this poetry, one in sign language and one in spoken English. And sometimes they would, banter back and forth, but it was extremely creative. So it wasn't just one piece of poetry, but it was also art as well. It was painting, it was sculpture, it was, you name it, it was performances, it was theater. And in the book, they talked about deaf music and how that just exploded and is all over the place now. So that's a positive example is online, specifically YouTube. There are numerous examples of deaf poetry or deaf musicians who are really kind of pushing the boundaries and pushing the envelope, which is wonderful. It's wonderful to see that transition. So that's the creativity spectrum for this is incredible. The other one is the cognitive portion of deaf gain. So from a psychological standpoint, they found a lot of different ways that deaf people think differently than a hearing person in very unique ways that makes it worth looking at. One statistic that I read just about shocked me, that deaf drivers have a lower accident rate and they have therefore cheaper insurance, which is great because see, their receptive skills are, very good. They see all the stuff in the peripheral vision where other people are not. So there's some people think, they have to, survival of the fittest, or survival adaptation, that a deaf person can catch things in the peripheral vision that hearing people cannot hear in the same situation. So that's just one very small example in a list of many. So when we think about, or we look at more research, it's just another example, is it the MRI, when somebody goes and has an MRI of their brain and they do an fMRI, it's just different technology that they do when they put the person in. They do a brain scan basically, and it shows, I mean, there's proof over and over and over again that deaf people really do think different than hearing people, especially people that use sign language, deaf people that use sign language as their primary mode of communication. So it changes the brain. And they reorganize, the brain reorganizes because of the deafness. People, what is, the interpreters missed the Matt Dye. Okay, it's a person, Matt Dye. That's his sign name. He did some research that looked at this side of the brain that I'm indicating, and it shows where the exact process of language happens for a hearing person, okay? And then deaf people, nope, it's completely the opposite because they're receptive information coming in through the eye gate. And whoa, that research just about knocked me off my chair. There is a complete reorganization that happens within the brain. And it just, I don't know how it happens, but it's fascinating. So we're talking cognition is definitely deaf gain if you use sign language. And then if we talk about from a cultural perspective, culturally deaf individuals, we can get, from a political standpoint, kind of a bit of a hot topic, if you know what I'm saying. But, deaf culture is there. It is what it is. And I really appreciate the differences from other cultures. There are many artists that I had mentioned before, poets, musicians, and the like, that are affiliated with deaf culture and make or produce. But it's beyond material. It's beyond material things. It's more of a deaf way of conversating, a deaf way of advocacy. It's something that we absolutely treasure about each other. So if two deaf people are walking down the street and they lock eyes with each other, each person is going to navigate that differently to make sure that they're safe. If there's a line, one might cross, one might say, you first, I'll go second. So that's just kind of a good example of a cultural practice from a deaf person's perspective. Once they lock eyes, if they both know sign language, it means you can't look. You can't look at the surrounding. You have to look at each other. Thank you. Another strong example of deaf gain from a cultural standpoint is in architecture. Architecture has very specific kind of architecture based on deafness. It's more clear, meaning that we've got space to be able to see in all directions. We need to know if there's people there or not. In a room, you may have an arc, for example. It means that deaf people, can see each other in the room and communicate easily without barriers. In a hallway, if you can imagine that, a hallway might be shaped in an arc instead of, a right angle. And that's done so that I can see all the way around that arc without any barriers. And that's that's mind-blowing for me. I never thought about that. They're building buildings in a deaf space to accommodate deaf people. And it's just in ways that just, it's astounding. So these are the 3 that you mentioned, but I'm going to add 2 more to your list. One that I'd like to add is philosophical. And that's where some of my research lands. A lot of my perspective on things from a deaf perspective. Well, hold on a second. There's 2 major categories. One is ethics.
Okay.
And that means, what is right, what is wrong, what is good, what is bad, what is allowable, and what is not allowable from a cultural standpoint. And deaf people have changed that has changed that equation. Being a deaf person means a specific orientation to reality. So if we recognize it is important for deaf people to protect themselves, we have to protect or the interpreter, help me with that. We have to protect. You're going to protect each other. We got to make sure we have to protect each other compared to, and that protection is needed at the same time as these other populations. For any marginalized culture, we have to consider that. So from an ethical standpoint, it's definitely changed for a deaf person. Aesthetically, or aesthetics, this is my sign for that, aesthetics. What is good? What is honest? What is beautiful? And my research team in Canada are finding or have found that it's specifically different. There's a different style of art, a different way to represent information, and that is specifically for deaf eyes and for visual information. And there's more research needed, no doubt. However, there's 2 philosophical changes related to deaf people. So that was the 4th one that I had. 5th one is technology. And again, another hot topic, lots of controversy affiliated with the technology portion of deaf gain. And I mean, I really, hot topic or not, I do not care. Hearing aids, cochlear implants, whatever you've got, I don't care. The technology is what I want. I want to know about it. For example, how are we teaching related to the technology that's currently in use? As deaf educators, they have to use very visual informations, whether it's a video or something hands-on, right? And we have to do it in a way that's different. And so I'm going to say over and over and over again, yes. It's a different measurement, however. It's important to understand that teachers, faculty, and everyone in the school system, including parents outside of the school system, have to be on board with this. And there's a few examples I'd like to share. Texting, for example. Texting has changed everything about how people communicate in the West. You know, who were the first people to get on board and use texting? Take a guess. Oh, yes, it was deaf people. I mean, hands down, they got on board with that way back. Remember the sidekick? Remember the sidekick, the pager? Another one here that is super popular is Zoom. We're on it right now. Video conferencing. That technology, who pushed that forward? way back in the day is deaf people. They pushed that through, and now it's everywhere, all over the world. Those are just two examples of basic changes that were moved forward because of deaf people.
Mm.
And one final example that I would like to include, all of us right now who are joining or running on modems to connect with the Wi-Fi. That's how we're connecting all across the globe. Guess who invented the modem?
What?
This person's name is Paul Tyler. And Paul Tyler is a deaf guy. He is deaf. Paul Tyler or Taylor? Paul, I'm going to put it in the chat so that everybody has access to that. Paul Taylor, thank you. Yeah, and I actually know Paul Taylor, and I've had the opportunity to hang out with him, and unfortunately he passed away, but before he did, he gave me the old thermos that he had for his coffee thermos. And I'm like, Paul invented the the modem, and I have his coffee thermos. So, you know, there's all of these things that are part of culture, creativity, cognition. Yes, absolutely. And the philosophical and, of course, the technology side of Deaf Gain.
I really love how you expanded on, added those two extra categories. You know, I think that there is more than just the three that we introduced at first. And typically when people think with Deaf Gain, they think, oh, great, you can sign through Windows. That's cool. Or you can sign and talk underwater, right?
That's true.
That's typically what you hear. But it goes a lot deeper than that, truly. There's a lot more layers to it. So thanks for expanding upon that and adding those two extra categories. I do have some more questions, but I do want to give a chance to the audience to ask any questions they might have. So I'm going to go ahead and allow some time for the audience to please ask their questions if they have them. And I would like to prioritize the families here first. So if there are no families questions or no questions from families, then we will go ahead with the general audience. But you can use the chat to send your question. You can open up your camera and talk through your video. It is up to you all.
Just kind of an FYI, we can talk about Deaf Gain. We can really talk about anything else that I've mentioned. I mean, any topic that I brought up, if you want. Yes, entirely up to you. I'm wide open. Ask me anything.
Oh, I think I do.
Anybody want? I don't bite, just in case you were concerned.
Crickets, no questions.
Briella, I have a question. I'm a mom of a daughter who is almost 2, so she's very young. She is hard of hearing. She's the first in our family, so we're all speaking, obviously. So how do I help her, or is it just something that comes natural for her to think in deafness, or like for her, when you were talking about when the instructor told you to stop thinking in English, to think as a deaf person, is that something that I can help facilitate, or is that something she's just going to choose to do or not to do? Or can you kind of elaborate, or I don't know, kind of direct me in that category?
Sure. Yeah, wonderful. 2 questions actually, and I hope I can do it justice. Let me keep my fingers crossed about that. First of all, what can you do? Okay. Deafness. We'll use the specific word. Ooh.
Supposes.
Well, for the interpreter, presupposes, thank you. A person who has deafness, but they're not automatically, they're not, it didn't just happen by itself. Something happened and it made that develop. It was some simulation that made that develop. It's the same with really any skill or ability. We have to exercise that muscle. We have to grow that skill. If you want big biceps, you have to do all the lifting of all the weights every day. If you don't do that, then those muscles will atrophy quite quickly. So specifically, it's the same concept with your brain. Your brain is a muscle. If a person does not stimulate the muscle using sign language, then the sign language is not going to happen. If we're not reading, then the literacy is not going to happen. It's the same concept. It's the same truth for your daughter at age 2 or whatever age. So if we want a laundry list of things to do, the first thing you have to do, because there's so many things you have to do, is exercise the muscle. Culturally, you need to culturally expose her to deaf events. Bring her to deaf events. Let her see deaf people. Let all different kinds of deaf people. Get her interacting with them in the local community. And, there's much wisdom to gain from the deaf community, and there's of course ways to technologically hang out with people as well. It's important though to socialize every opportunity you can with any deaf person at the deaf events. If you don't sign in your house or you aren't signing yet, I have to encourage you, and I will say, please, I'm begging you, please, to start now. If you don't start now and you don't put that first, it won't be there. And I can't emphasize this enough. To all deaf children have to have exposure to sign language, period, end of story. So, and all different registers of sign language as well. So the best time in history of the world to find, why the interpreter completely overlooked that. Media, in the media. Right, there's sign language in the media, thank you. YouTube has people using sign language. It's a wonderful resource. But beyond that, a local library, for example, can help. There's so many resources there. Technology has resources at your fingertips. You can find anything. So I encourage you, please study. Please get her involved right now. Don't wait until tomorrow. Start today. If you start with something very basic, you, me, ABC, look over here. That is going to be a huge benefit to your daughter. Secondly, and another good question you asked about facilitating communication and facilitating language. Right now, what's really hot, or a hot topic in research, is something called trans language. Trans language. There's a sign for that. Trans language. What that means is that each person has in themselves an ability to express, multilingual, and they go between many different people. Thank you. And it develops a skill that encourages the brain to be able to facilitate communication between two people, or one person and two people. And beyond that basic skill, they have a bilingual and multilingual pedagogy, 2 or more languages. So we encourage teaching children more than the single language. And within that skill and within that training, the brain will understand 1 language or 2 language, or possibly 3. It's called, and they will all then overlap. And it's not really a hard line. You know, is it one language? Is it two languages? Is it three language? It's just that these languages are all going to work together. It's a mind and body type connection. So we got to, you know, like I dropped the speaking and all of a sudden I could do the teaching that I was trying to do in sign language. But boy, those are really great questions.
Those were great. Okay, we do have one more question from the chat. This probably will be our last question that we'll take at this time. So this is from Heather and Leah. So it says, how can parents, families, or anyone embrace, cherish, or foster that deaf gain mindset in their deaf students or deaf children?
Heather and Leah, hi. I'm glad the two of you are here. It's wonderful. Really, it's such a worthwhile question. They're both very, very, very basic, but extremely complicated at the same time. Yeah, I'm going to start with the complicated part first, okay? We, in deaf education, need a system shift, like a 180. Really, there's just no two ways about it. Right now, we are kind of stuck in a, just stuck in this mode. People are they're just set in their ways and how they think. People who have strong negative biases against multi or bilingualism, and sometimes, you know, yeah, bilingualism. This is the sign that I use for bilingualism. And sometimes people who think that we are supporting allies, they're really not. So in deaf education, we have to be persistent. We have to have a persistent ideology. English is worth more. English is not worth more than sign language. That ideology is prejudice. I mean, it's infectious prejudice. And that we just need to trash that idea, because that's the necessary first step to change the system or have a system shift. Will it ever shift? Who knows? Maybe, maybe not. But we still have an obligation today to do what we can do to lessen the impact for these children. In deaf education, there's a new concept, and I mentioned it a little bit today, called harm reduction. Excuse me, harm reduction. Thank you. It's a new word, but we borrowed it from the biomedical ethics. Here we go. Oh, neat. Yeah, bioethics. It's a medical perspective of do no harm. And you've probably heard that before. You know, the Hippocratic Oath, or Hippocrates came up with that. And that applies in deaf education as well, everywhere. For example, many deaf children have language deprivation. And that means that there are adults in their family who have robbed them of the opportunity to grow and become healthy deaf individuals. And that is harm. There are no two ways to look. You can't interpret that any other way. So there are studies to show that if a deaf child has language deprivation in their brain, already, it means that their brain is,
Matter.
there's gray matter in their brain reduces. Thank you. What that means is that language deprivation has damaged the brain in the child. And it can't be reversed later. Okay? Oh, so harm reduction early on in a deaf child's life and in the education is huge. We have got to change that to 180-degree change in the schools, in the school systems, in the sports. Everything needs to be in sign language. We need to have extracurricular activities related to sign language. You know, even a bus driver needs to sign. Every single person in this child's life needs to know sign language. And I really would love to foster that environment. And it's not just like one little activity that we do by one person. It's not, it's far deeper than that. It's a complete paradigm shift. These kids, we've got to stop hurting these kids.
Well said. Thank you. That's powerful. Yeah, really poignant. I mean, I have chills. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. So it is 8 o'clock, and I really would love to keep going and keep chatting tonight. But I think we're going to have to invite you back for another future event and have
Absolutely.
dive in again, dive deeper, and learn more. I did learn that new sign today about pedagogy. Yeah,
Yes.
pedagogy.
It's a French sign, actually. It's a French sign. We borrowed it from French Sign Language.
Cool. Well, definitely, we're going to have to invite you back to talk more in depth about that concept.
Definitely. I'm happy to.
Well, thank you all for coming tonight. If you do have any further questions, feel free to email me and I'm happy to forward that over to Dr. Skyer. This video recording, oh yeah, and I mean, you can email him too yourself if you would like, actually. But thank you all for coming tonight. The video will be recorded, and if you would like that recording, when you registered, you would have clicked yes, and then it will be sent to you.
Just contact me via email.
Great. Well, have a wonderful night. And, if you want to open up your camera now